In the brutal world of Ironwood State Prison, Marcus the Bear taught him rules with fists and fear, targeting anyone who dares stand out. When quiet newcomer Caleb Jones, a black man with a mysterious past, refuses to break under Marcus's relentless bullying, the yard braces for blood. But Caleb's silence hides a secret. He's a former kung fu master, haunted by a tragedy that led him to swear off fighting. As racial slurs, stolen memories, and violent ambushes push him to the edge, Caleb faces a choice: keep his vow or unleash his skills to dismantle a corrupt system. The air in Ironwood State Prison's cell block hung thick, a silence so oppressive it seemed to choke the very breath from the men inside, as if the walls themselves were waiting for violence to tear through the stillness. Inmates shuffled across the yard, their sneakers scuffing the cracked concrete, their eyes darting toward a hulking figure moving through the crowd with the menace of a storm cloud. Marcus the Bear. Totem, the prison's unchallenged tyrant, had his sights locked on a new target. A quiet black man sitting alone at a rusted metal table, his fingers tracing the frayed edges of a tattered book, its cover worn to a faded blur. Marcus's lips twisted into a smirk, his knuckles cracking with a sound that cut through the yard like a gunshot, a signal of the pain he was about to inflict. He'd broken men before, newcomers, loners, anyone who dared to hold their head too high, and this guy, with his calm eyes and unbothered posture, was just another mark to be crushed. The other inmates watched, their whispers barely rising above the metallic clank of steel gates slamming shut. They knew Marcus's game. He didn't just draw blood. He shattered spirits, leaving men hollowed out, shadows of who they'd been. But something about this new inmate, Caleb Jones, felt off, like a note played wrong in a song they all knew by heart. Marcus loomed over him, his shadow swallowing the faint sunlight, barking insults that echoed across the yard, slurs about Caleb's race, jabs at his lean frame, mockery of the silence that clung to him like armor. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't even lift his eyes from the page, as if the words in that book held the key to surviving this hell. Why didn't he react? Why didn't he beg or run like the others before him? The yard buzzed with murmurs. Some inmates swore he was paralyzed by fear. Others caught a glint in his eye, a spark of something dangerous, something that didn't belong in a place like Ironwood. Marcus, impatient, tired of the defiance in Caleb's stillness, shoved him hard, the force knocking Caleb's chair back, expecting him to crumple into the dirt. Instead, Caleb's head lifted slowly, his gaze steady as the edge of a gathering storm, and in that moment the air in the yard shifted, heavy with the weight of something unspoken, something alive. Even the guards, lounging against the chain link fence, their radios crackling faintly, paused their lazy chatter, their eyes narrowing as they sensed the change. Was Caleb just another number in a faded jumpsuit, or was there a secret buried deep in his past, something that could unravel the fragile, brutal order of this concrete wasteland? Ironwood State Prison crouched in the California desert like a beast carved from concrete and despair, its walls stained with the sweat and blood of men who'd long forgotten what hope tasted like. It was the summer of 2023, and inside these walls, power didn't belong to the warden or the guards. It belonged to men like Marcus Totem, a 6-foot, 4X gang enforcer serving life for armed robbery and a string of assaults that left bodies broken and lives in ruins. His presence dominated the yard, his fists a law more binding than any rulebook, his reputation built on the fear he inspired. Marcus had carved out his empire by preying on the weak, especially new inmates who hadn't yet learned the unspoken rules of survival in Ironwood's jungle. His crew, a ragtag mix of loyal thugs and terrified followers, enforced his will, their loyalty bought with promises of protection or threats of pain. The guards, some corrupted by cash slipped under tables, others just too worn down to care, let Marcus run the show, their eyes conveniently elsewhere when his fists fell. Marcus thrived on this control, his favorite ritual being the breaking of anyone who dared to stand out, anyone who refused to bend beneath his shadow. Caleb Jones arrived on a blistering Tuesday, the heat shimmering off the asphalt as his transfer bus rolled through the gates. His papers listed a single, stark charge: manslaughter. At 42, he was lean, his shaved head catching the harsh desert sun, a jagged scar running from his left ear to his jaw like a roadmap to some forgotten battle. He spoke barely a word, kept his distance from the cliques that ruled the cell blocks, and carried a dog-eared copy of The Art of War tucked under his arm, its pages yellowed and soft from years of handling. To the inmates, his quiet was a neon sign of weakness, a guarantee he'd break under pressure. Marcus saw it too, and to him, Caleb was a challenge, a black man who didn't cower, didn't beg, didn't play the game of submission that Ironwood demanded. The yard crackled with tension the moment Marcus marked him, his eyes glinting with the thrill of a new hunt. Whispers spread like wildfire among the inmates. Who was this guy? Some called him a drifter, just another lost soul chewed up by the system. Others swore they saw something in his walk, a coiled strength that seemed out of place in a world of broken men. Caleb's past was a locked box, but it wasn't empty. Years ago, in the heart of Oakland, he'd been a kung fu master, running a dojo that was a sanctuary for street kids with nowhere else to go. His students called him Sifu, revered him for turning their anger into discipline, their fear into focus, until a tragedy, a death he couldn't stop, shattered his world and landed him behind these walls. Now he was just inmate 47,219, his skills buried beneath layers of grief and a vow to never raise his fists again. The guards, led by Sergeant Victor Hayes, a man with a reputation for pocketing cash from Marcus's crew, watched the dynamic unfold with a lazy kind of interest. Hayes had a knack for ignoring complaints, especially from minority inmates. His reports always skewed to favor the powerful. Caleb's arrival piqued his curiosity, not because he cared about Caleb, but because Marcus had promised to handle any troublemakers who threatened the prison's delicate balance. Ironwood ran on an unspoken pact. Marcus kept the inmates in line, and the guards got to keep their hands clean, their shifts easy. But Caleb's presence was a splinter in that machine, a quiet disruption that set teeth on edge. He didn't join a gang, didn't pay for protection, didn't even blink when Marcus's crew started their taunt. Racial slurs hissed in the chow line, a tray knocked from his hands in the mess hall, a deliberate shoulder check in the narrow corridor that smelled of bleach and despair. Inmates began to murmur, their bets shifting. Was Caleb broken, or was he holding something back, waiting for a moment no one could predict? The trouble sparked to life on Caleb's third day, a moment that felt like it could burn the yard to ash. It was rec time, the sun blazing off the barbed wire that ringed the perimeter, when Marcus and his crew cornered Caleb at his solitary table. The book, The Art of War, lay open before him, its pages fluttering in the dry desert wind like a flag of defiance. Marcus towered over him, his shadow swallowing the light, his voice a low growl that carried across the yard. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" He spat, snatching the book and tossing it into the dirt, its pages splaying like a wounded bird. The crowd held its breath, the air thick with the promise of violence they'd seen play out 100 times before. Marcus's fist shot out, shoving Caleb back in his chair, the metal screeching against the concrete like a scream cut short. But Caleb didn't move, didn't speak, his eyes steady as polished stone, his hands resting on his knees as if he were meditating in the eye of a hurricane. The inmates exchanged glances. Nobody ignored Marcus like that. Nobody walked away unscathed. The shove was meant to be the end, the moment Caleb begged or broke, but instead he stood slowly, brushing the dust from his jumpsuit with deliberate care, his movements almost ceremonial, like a ritual from another life. The murmurs grew louder, disbelief, curiosity, a thread of fear weaving through the crowd. Marcus's face twisted, his ego bruised by the quiet defiance in Caleb's stance. the way he refused to play the victim. Over the next week, the bullying became a relentless campaign, a war waged with fists and whispers. Marcus's crew turned it into a sport, tripping Caleb in the chow line, spilling his watery oatmeal across the floor, stealing his commissary. Soap, toothpaste, a single faded photo of a young boy no older than 10 that Caleb kept tucked inside his book, its edges worn from years of careful handling. They spread rumors, vicious and deadly, calling him a snitch, a label that could get a man killed in a place like Ironwood, where trust was rarer than freedom. Marcus led the charge, his taunts personal, laced with racial venom that stung deeper than fists. "You ain't nothing in here," he spat one evening, slamming Caleb against a cell block wall, the impact echoing down the corridor while the guards, including Hayes, pretended to check their clipboards. Caleb's silence only fueled Marcus's rage, like a fire fed by defiance, his calm a challenge that Marcus couldn't let stand. The yard became a betting pool, inmates trading cigarettes and favors over how long Caleb would last before he snapped or bled out. Most gave him a week, maybe less. But there were cracks in Caleb's armor, moments only a few caught in the dim light of the cell block. Late one night, during a lockdown, the air heavy with the smell of rust and sweat, an older inmate named Pops, a lifer with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many men fall, leaned across their shared cell. "Boy, you got a death wish?" he asked, his voice rough but low, noticing Caleb's knuckles, bruised from gripping the edge of his bunk too tightly, as if holding himself together by sheer will. Caleb's voice came soft, barely a whisper, like it hurt to speak. "I don't want trouble, Pops, but I don't run either." Pops pressed, sensing a story buried beneath the surface, and Caleb let slip fragments of his life. A dojo in Oakland, kids who called him Sifu, their voices echoing in his memory, a street fight that went wrong and cost him everything. He didn't elaborate, didn't linger on the details, but Pops saw it in his eyes. A man who'd fought battles most couldn't fathom, a man carrying a weight heavier than the bars that caged them. The conflict reached its boiling point during a work detail in the prison laundry, a humid, windowless room that reeked of bleach and despair, a place where cameras didn't reach and the guards' footsteps never lingered. Marcus, assigned to the same crew, saw his chance, his fingers curling around a metal pipe, its edge rusted but heavy enough to crack bone. He swung it at Caleb's head, the air hissing with the force of it. The other inmates froze, their breaths caught, expecting a body to hit the floor, another name erased. But Caleb moved like water, his body flowing to the side, the pipe whistling past his ear, missing by inches. In a single, fluid motion, he grabbed Marcus's wrist, twisting it with a precision that spoke of years of training, until the pipe clattered to the concrete, the sound sharp as a gunshot. He didn't strike back, didn't raise his voice, just locked eyes with Marcus and said, "Walk away." His voice was steady, sharp as a blade, cutting through the tension. Marcus, his wrist throbbing, stumbled back, his face a mask of shock and humiliation, his crew staring in disbelief. The yard buzzed with the story by nightfall. The new guy had disarmed the bear without throwing a punch, a feat that felt like a myth in a place built on brutality. The guards caught wind of it too, their radios crackling with hushed reports. Hayes, leaning back in his office, a cheap fan rattling on his desk, didn't like what he heard. Caleb was a problem, a glitch in the system he and Marcus had built, a system that kept the prison quiet and their pockets lined. He called Marcus in, his voice low, dripping with promise. "Fix this," he said, sliding a pack of cigarettes across the desk, "and you'll eat well for a month." Marcus nodded, his pride stinging like an open wound, and planned his revenge. A public beatdown in the yard, where every inmate would see Caleb break, where the hierarchy would be restored. But Caleb's restraint wasn't fear. It was discipline, forged in a life Marcus couldn't begin to understand. Years ago, in Oakland, Caleb had made a vow after a student. A boy with a crooked smile and dreams of escape died in a street brawl he couldn't stop. The guilt was a chain around his heart, a promise to never fight again, to never let his fists become a weapon. But Ironwood was a different beast, and Marcus wasn't just a bully. He was a predator backed by a system that thrived on cruelty, a system that wanted Caleb broken, one way or another. The yard turned into a pressure cooker, the air thick with the promise of blood, the kind of tension that made men check their backs in the corridors. Marcus rallied his crew, doubling down on their campaign, spreading lies that Caleb was working with the guards, a rumor that could get a man shanked in his sleep in a place where trust was a currency nobody could afford. Inmates who'd once ignored Caleb now watched him like hawks, their eyes tracking his every move, some with fear, others with a flicker of respect, a hope they didn't dare voice. Pops, the only one who knew even a sliver of Caleb's truth, cornered him one night in their cell, the dim light casting shadows across the cracked walls. "They're coming for you, son," he said, his voice rough with worry, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette he'd traded a week's meals for. "You can't stay quiet forever." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight, his fingers tracing the scar on his face, but he said nothing more, his silence a wall that even Pops couldn't breach. The prison's corrupt heart began to pulse louder, its rot seeping into every corner. Hayes, frustrated by Caleb's defiance, started falsifying reports, scribbling lies in Caleb's file, disorderly conduct, inciting unrest, building a case to send him to solitary or a worse fate. Marcus's crew upped their game, their attacks growing bolder, more vicious. They slashed Caleb's mattress, leaving it in ribbons on his bunk. They slipped bleach into his water, the sharp smell stinging his throat. They cornered him in the showers, makeshift blades glinting in their hands, the air heavy with the threat of blood. Each time, Caleb evaded or endured, his movements precise, almost inhuman, his eyes burning with a fire he kept locked away, a fire that flickered brighter with every attack. Inmates started to talk, their whispers spreading through the cell blocks like a virus. A young prisoner, Jamal, barely 19 and already scarred from Marcus's fists, caught Caleb dodge a shank in the mess hall with a speed that didn't make sense, his body twisting just enough to let the blade graze his jumpsuit. "Man's got moves," Jamal whispered to Pops, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief, his hands shaking as he clutched his tray. The rumor spread like wildfire. The quiet guy wasn't just lucky. He was something else, something dangerous. Caleb's past came into focus, piece by painful piece, like a puzzle assembled in the dark. Pops pieced it together from their late night talks when the cell block was quiet except for the hum of flickering lights and the distant coughs of men who'd never sleep easy. Caleb had run a dojo in Oakland, a haven for kids who had nothing but anger and nowhere to put it. Kids who reminded him of the boy he'd once been, growing up in a world that offered no mercy. He'd taught them kung fu, not to fight, but to find discipline, to channel their pain into something stronger, something that could keep them alive. He'd been their sifu, their guide, his voice steady as he led them through forms in a cramped gym that smelled of sweat and hope. But a rival gang targeted his students, saw their strength as a threat. One night, trying to protect them, Caleb fought back, his fists faster than thought, his forms a blur of power and precision. But a kid, a 16-year-old named Malik with a laugh like summer and dreams of college, got caught in the crossfire, a stray bullet tearing through his chest. He died in Caleb's arms, his blood soaking the pavement, and Caleb couldn't stop it. The guilt broke him, sent him to Ironwood, and made him swear off the skills that had once defined him, the skills that had failed Malik. But Ironwood wasn't Oakland, and Marcus wasn't some street punk. He was a predator backed by a system that let him thrive, a system that rewarded cruelty, and looked away from justice. The turning point came during a prison basketball game, one of those rare moments when the yard felt almost human. The clink of the ball against the rusted hoop, a fleeting distraction from the weight of the walls. Marcus, playing dirty, slammed Caleb to the ground, his elbow catching Caleb's jaw, drawing a thin line of blood that glistened in the sun. The crowd roared, expecting Caleb to stay down, to crawl away like so many before him, another broken man. Instead, he rose, his stance low, his eyes locked on Marcus like a predator sizing up prey. For the first time, he spoke loud enough for the yard to hear, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You don't know what you're starting." Marcus laughed loud and forced, his bravado a mask for the unease creeping into his gut. But the other inmates saw something he didn't. A man who'd been pushed too far, a man whose silence wasn't weakness but a dam holding back a flood. The guards, sensing the shift, tightened their grip, their hands lingering on batons, their radios crackling with coded warnings. Hayes doubled down, pulling Caleb aside after the game, his breath sour with coffee and contempt. "Fall in line," he hissed, "or I'll send you to a place where nobody comes back whole." But the inmates were changing too, their allegiances shifting like sand. Jamal, Pops, and a handful of others, men who'd been beaten down by Marcus or ignored by the system, started looking to Caleb, not Marcus, for something to believe in. The yard was a tinderbox, and Caleb's silence was the spark, a fuse burning closer to detonation with every passing day. Marcus planned his final move, a coordinated ambush during a lockdown, when the guards would be too busy to notice, when the cameras would be blind and the corridors would echo with screams. But word travels fast in a place like Ironwood, carried on whispers and glances. Jamal overheard Marcus's crew plotting in the chow hall, their voices low but reckless, talking about blades and blood, about teaching the new guy a lesson he wouldn't survive. He found Caleb in the prison library, a corner of Ironwood where men went to escape the chaos, where the smell of old paper offered a fleeting reprieve. Jamal's hands shook as he relayed the plan, his eyes wide with fear and something else. Hope, maybe, that Caleb could be more than just another victim. Caleb listened, his face unreadable, his fingers tracing the scar on his jaw, the same scar he'd earned trying to save Malik all those years ago. He faced a choice. Keep his vow, the one that kept his guilt at bay, the one that honored the boy he'd failed, or fight for his life in a system that wanted him broken, that thrived on men like Marcus and guards like Hayes. The lockdown came on a Friday, the cell block dim under flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects, casting jagged shadows across the concrete. Marcus and his crew moved like wolves, their steps silent but purposeful, cornering Caleb in a blind spot near the laundry. A narrow corridor where the air was thick with the stench of bleach, and the walls were stained with years of neglect. No cameras watched here, no guards patrolled, the perfect place for blood to spill. Marcus swung first, a blade glinting in his fist, the metal catching the faint light like a predator's eye. The inmates watching, Jamal, Pops, a dozen others who'd followed out of curiosity or fear, braced for the inevitable, their breaths caught in their throats, expecting Caleb to fall. Another name erased in Ironwood's endless ledger of the broken. But Caleb moved like a shadow, his body flowing out of the blade's path with a grace that didn't belong in a place like this, his movements fluid, almost otherworldly. With precise strikes, he disarmed Marcus, his kung fu forms unfolding like a dance, each motion controlled, deliberate, a testament to years of training buried beneath his vow. Marcus's crew rushed him, 5 men armed with shanks and fists, their faces twisted with rage and desperation to preserve their king's throne. One by one, they fell, knees buckled under targeted strikes, wrists snapped with a flick of Caleb's hands, egos shattered on the cold concrete floor. Caleb didn't gloat, didn't taunt. He fought with a quiet fury, his strikes no harder than they needed to be, his eyes burning with a fire he'd kept locked away for too long. Marcus, battered and bleeding, hit the ground last, his massive frame collapsing like a toppled statue, his reign over, his myth shattered in a matter of minutes. The yard was silent, the inmates staring at a man they'd underestimated, a man who'd turned their world upside down without raising his voice. The aftermath was a storm that swept through Ironwood like a wildfire. Inmates, risking everything, recorded the fight on smuggled phones, the grainy footage spreading through the cell blocks like contraband, passed from hand to hand in the dead of night. It leaked beyond the walls, hitting the outside world through a guard who'd grown tired of Hayes's corruption, sparking outrage on news feeds and forums. The video showed not just Caleb's fight, but the guard's negligence, Hayes's corruption, the system that let men like Marcus thrive while men like Caleb were targeted for their silence. The prison administration, under pressure from a public that wouldn't look away, launched an investigation, their suits and clipboards a stark contrast to the yard's grit. Hayes was suspended, his desk cleared out by men in suits who didn't smile, his name whispered as a warning to other guards who'd forgotten their oaths. Marcus lost his privileges, his crew scattered, his power reduced to whispers of a man who used to be something, a king dethroned in a single brutal moment. Caleb, bruised but unbroken, became a legend in the yard, though he didn't want the title. In the weeks that followed, he sat with Jamal and Pops under the weak shade of a dying tree, teaching them not kung fu, but discipline, how to carry pain without letting it define you, how to find strength in a place designed to steal it. The story wasn't just about a fight, about fists and blood in a concrete corridor. It was about a man who turned his pain into power, who faced a system rigged to crush him and walked away whole. It was about justice, the kind that doesn't come from a gavel or a badge, but from the quiet strength of someone who refused to break, who chose to fight not for himself, but for the men who'd lost hope. Every man in Ironwood had a story, a moment when the world tried to grind them down, but Caleb's was different because he didn't just survive. He changed the rules, rewrote the script of a place that thrived on despair. His fight wasn't just against Marcus. It was against the lies, the corruption, the system that let predators rule. And in that fight, he showed that even in the darkest corners, a single spark could start a fire. Have you ever been pushed too far, found a strength you didn't know you had, a moment when you stood up and the world had to listen? Drop your story in the comments, let the world hear it. Like this video if Caleb's fight left you stunned, if you felt that shock when the quiet man turned the tables, when the underdog became the storm. Share it if you believe justice can rise from silence, that one person, against all odds, can stand against a system and win. Subscribe for more stories of people who fight back, who find their strength in the places where hope is hardest to hold, where the world tries to break you but you rise instead.